that going forward, we must remember that if we operate regionally, and this is why I think it is very critical. Look at the East African region, and I'm going to give this region. This region puts together Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan. We know that South Sudan, up till the 31st day of March, which is only 3 days ago, there was no case of corona. They had only tested 18. If they were to engage in robust testing, perhaps there would be people with symptoms. But if we were to coordinate regionally, perhaps we would help those who have the capacity to do so. Burundi also found herself in a similar situation. If we go down south, we know that the Zimbabwean economy has been battered by sanctions. We know that almost 70 to 80% of the Zimbabweans live out of employment and therefore live below $1 a day. If we are to go to West Africa, to countries such as Niger, Central African Republic, and we go to countries such as Mali and Mauritania, the situation is dire, the economic situation first. So my own view is the African Development Bank and other Pan-African institutions must now be in the lead. When we develop a vaccine, how do we test them? Because we live in a continent where when the Federal Drug Administration Authority in the United States has tested a vaccine, then Africa assumes that is fine. If the Europeans have tested a vaccine, then we think it is fine. When the Chinese have tested one, we think it is fine. Why can't we, during this period, begin to see the political class empowering the scientist class with a view to ensuring that we move into the direction of discovery? Our universities should be empowered, our institutions. So I've spoken about that, and I'm saying our standardization should be homegrown. That does not mean and cannot mean that we shall not collaborate with others. But as Ali Mazrui once said, we cannot be a continent which is in the business of consuming what it does not produce and consuming what it does not produce. And secondly, on the economic front, we've got to look at our feeble economies. I've already talked about some of the countries that rely on tourism. Tourism is dead for the next 2 years, even more. You look at the aviation sector, all the airlines and most African airlines really were suffering except the Ethiopian airline. And if you look at, you go beyond that sector, you go into the flower sector, you go into mining sector. All these sectors are affected in a very fundamental way. And that brings me to the question of lockdown. Yes. Perhaps the word lockdown is the word that is confusing us because it's also a foreign word. Lockdown, as we understand it and as we have seen it deployed in Wuhan, in China, and as being deployed in Uganda and in South Africa, means, number one, that you will be confined to your house, you will remain there, and those who are confining you to your house assume, among other things, that you'll have stocked on food, that you have refrigerator, that you have a microwave, and that you have all these provisions, and you'll be able to ride the lockdown. Mm-hmm. How many Africans have refrigerators? Yeah. How many Africans have microwaves? How many Africans can afford to stock on food? Those who go to construction sites and are paid $1 on that day and they use half of it for consumption, are our governments ready to cater for them? And I'm not minimizing the impact of this unknown virus. I'm simply saying, before you order lockdown, think through it. Work with the neighborhood associations. Ensure that your supermarkets can work. I hear some of our government officials across Africa say that you can order food, that it will be delivered to your doorsteps. If you are in an informal system in Makoko, in Lagos, in Nigeria, How do you order food to be brought to which house, which is floating in Makoko?
Really?
So these are the critical issues that I think ought to be brought to bear. And the third thing is when you deploy police officers, when you deploy the armed forces, they ought to be told that the country is not at war with the citizenry. And therefore, it does not require them to use the force to put down the citizenry. In my view, those who are in the military, those who are in the police department must behave as if they were Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, even when they are imposing these lockdown or dusk to dawn curfews.
Professor, wait, it's getting. It is interesting. I mean, we can only listen and listen and listen. Can you connect him back? He will see. Yeah.
Can I be heard?
Oh yes. There is a question from one coming from Kenya. She says she's from the Garissa County, and she says up till now Kenya is refusing that there has been no corona or COVID-19 case in Kenya. And what would you say about that?
No, perhaps that was that question was framed long before now, because the Kenyan government, to her credit, I think thus far has been giving statistics, and we do know, for example, that yesterday there were slightly over 80 people who had been had tested positive, and that there are 2,000 people had been tested. We also know that people who have been suspected have been quarantined in different areas. So the position now is that the Kenyan government is reporting and is giving a daily update on the situation in the country relating to those who have tested positive for COVID-19. But the other thing that I see in many African countries, just to ride on the crest of that question, is the assumption by many African politicians, when you hear them talk, is as if the country is the capital city. So that when you hear many African countries, they speak as if you are talking about Mali, it is in Bamako. If you are talking about South Africa, is in Johannesburg, or if you are talking about Zimbabwe, is in Harare. The truth is that the bulk of Africans still live in rural Africa.
That's true.
And therefore, when you talk about lockdown, you also have to ask yourself, or you have these measures, you've got to ask yourselves how you are dealing with the different publics. If you look at the United States of America, for example, the reaction of the United States of America federal government to New York is not necessarily their reaction in Oklahoma or in some other state like Washington or Idaho. So too in African countries, in Nigeria, when we are dealing with the federal capital in Abuja or in Lagos or in Ogun State, or in Delta State, or in Katsina, or Zamfara, or in any other, or any one of those, we've got to ask ourselves what the situation is. We must also not forget that there are places in Africa where there is conflict. If you look at southern Cameroon, which is in conflict, and therefore the ground is destabilized, how are we going to deal with the situation in southern Cameroon or in Amazonia? How are we dealing with Central African Republic? How are we dealing with the situation in Eastern Congo? How are we dealing with the situation in Northern Burkina Faso, in the Sahelian region? How are we dealing with the situation in Libya? All these are silent events. And I don't hear, perhaps they are saying it, but I'm sufficiently keen to have known, but I'm not hearing the voice of the African Union. I'm not hearing the voice of SADC. I know that President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the current chair of the African Union, did hold a meeting of his bureau and issued a statement. But the statement did not have teeth. It did not have fire. It did not deal with the mundane issues. That is what I want to hear from my leaders, because we are at war with an enemy which is invisible, and we must be on a war footing, but it's a different kind of war. That war and that enemy will not be shot down with bullets. It will be shot down with ideas. It will be shot down when the government accepts that it has no monopoly of ideas or wisdom, and that you need to recruit people in different sectors. I've already, at the risk of repeating myself, asked those now non-governmental organizations that are active in the medical sector, the universities, the research institutions, the business community. A good warrior, a good war general fights a war, but also thinks of the post-war environment.
Thank you very, very much, Professor. We have one last question before we leave. We are also 1 minute into the closing of this show, but this question is very important because it's coming from a feedback that you made 2015 in Dar es Salaam. And the question is, she called, African leaders, when they are sick, they run away to seek treatment in Europe, America, and Asia. Do you think this COVID-19 in other side is another side as a lesson learned for the ministers or the leaders in the public sector or in general?
Oh, and I'm speaking rather cynically here. If there was anything that was to open the eyes of African politicians, this is it. Today, if you have been victimized by COVID-19 and you are an African president, an African cabinet minister, an African bureaucrat, there are no planes to fly you to Europe and America. There are no planes to fly you to India. There are no planes to fly you to Dubai. You are with the rest of the Africans. And what is the lesson to be learned? Don't give more money to the military than you give to your health sector. Don't give money to the salaries of bureaucrats, but give more money to the health sector. Remember that research and development is at the heart of the development of any nation. Remember that manufacturing is also critical. We must be a nation that is capable of nations that can have their state-of-the-art hospitals, nations that can research in the area of medicine and have pharmaceutical companies, nations that are capable of supplying their own people with medical equipment and supplies. That is the nations, that is the nation, and those are the nations that we desire. And I pray and hope that post-corona, our leaders will not suffer from selective amnesia and begin to behave as if there was no corona. They must now take a solemn vow that when this corona is controlled and tamed, our urgent business will be to improve our health sector. Our urgent business will be to ensure that we give sufficient funds to research and development. Our urgent business will be to ensure that our men and women who are in the medical profession are compensated more than we compensate our politicians. Yes. I look forward to those days. I look forward to the opening of minds. I pray that those of you who are in the diaspora look to the continent. You may remain where you are, but coordinate and help your motherland.